So last week I implemented an onboarding slider for my app. As you can see, you have a series of videos that have their own caption and they start and autoplay when you switch between the slides. I'll be showing you how to build a slider like this, and trust me, even if you know SwiftUI, there will be things that you will learn along the way. Now let's get into the video. So we're gonna start with a very simple structure. I've created here an onboarding slide struct which has a title, a description, and a slide. The slide itself is going to be an any view. Any view is what it's called a type eraser. It allows you to arbitrarily set any type of view, but only a view. So what that means is that if I decide to change the any view of one of these onboarding slides to be hello, is instantly going to complain because this is not a view. So it is safe enough to use as a type that only refers to the views. And then lastly, I'm adding an ID and having this confirmed to identifiable so we can put this in an array of slides. With all that said, let's get started with the structure of the slider. We're gonna start with a scroll view. And in this scroll view, we're going to have a H tag. Now we're gonna make the scroll view horizontal as well, so that the H tag actually makes sense. So after we've created the H tag, we need to iterate through our slides. And for that, we're gonna be using a for each. And this is where it gets a little bit convoluted. Typically, you would assume that you can just use an array here, but because we actually need to use the index of each of the slides, meaning that we need to know which slide is currently in view, we're gonna need to know what their index is. So we need to convert our slides into an enumeration in Swift. And then we need to access the ID manually. Typically, when you're dealing with identifiable, you can just pass slides directly into for each. But because we're doing the conversion, we actually need to tell for each how to access the ID. Luckily, we do have access to the element in the enumeration. And then from the element, we're going to be getting the ID. And this ID is actually referring to the onboarding slide. We can then, we're going to be getting a tuple that we can get the index. And we're also going to be getting the slide itself. And this is going to allow us to basically do this, slide that slide. And now we're getting the actual slides. And you can see that I can actually start scrolling somewhat. So what I'm going to be doing next is I'm going to make each slide a little bit wider so we can kind of see what's going on. We're going to make the each one of them 300. So now you can see that I can scroll horizontally. Now, one thing to note is that we're getting the scrolling indicator here. So we can change that very easily. We can do a scroll view and then we can do show indicators and we can do that false. Now let's tweak it a little bit more. So the first thing I want to do is I want to increase the spacing between the slides. Let's make the spacing be, let's do 12. I think 12 is a good number. And now we're gonna round them up. Easy enough, we can call clip shape and we're gonna be passing a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 30. Let's make that a little bit more exaggerated. Let's give it a 48. I think it looks a little bit nicer. Just for the demonstration purposes, I'm gonna make all the slides semi-transparent. So we're gonna make it, let's make it 30%. That way it's just not like as jarring. And now you can see here that the slides are obviously starting from the very beginning. And you obviously don't want to do a padding outside of the scroll view because what happens is that it's going to crop, right? So what I think is best to do here is to add a content margin that will only apply horizontally. And it's going to be of 30 in this case. And this is going to indicate to the scroll view that our content is going to start 30 pixels in. Now, we still don't have that swiping behavior, and trust me, it's actually not that hard to do. What we first want to do is we want to register the H tag as a scroll target layout. This is the equivalent as giving each of these slides the same property, scroll target, not a target layout, but this will automatically apply to all of them. And you know, if we got a little bit fancier and had different types of views in addition to this for each, this would do it for all of its children. And now the one thing that we want to do then is to have a scroll behavior, scroll target behavior, and then we want to do a view aligned. With that small change, now we have that behavior. We are automatically anchoring into the corresponding view. And because we added this content margin, we have this automatically applied. So it knows where to log in. So now we're officially done with the actual slides. And now I'm going to start adding the text. You could argue you could have the text itself inside of each of the slides, right? So in theory, what I could do here is I can wrap each of the slides in a V-stack. like this, and then I can add a text that can be a slide title. And this is automatically going to apply each of the titles to each of the slides. However, in my case, I wanted to have a little bit longer of a content and I wanted it to span the whole width. So because I'm dealing with videos, I don't want the text to only be constrained to the width of the video. So instead, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a Z stack. And inside of this Z stack, we're going to do something very similar. We're going to use a for each with the exact same type of iteration. If I left it like this, it's going to look kind of wild. So in this case, we're actually going to be using the text. So we're going to do something like text, slide, title. Now, of course, all of the titles are juxtaposed on top of each other because it's a Z stack. So what we want to do is to animate the titles. So only show the one for the current slide. And as we swipe between the slides, we fade out the current one and we fade in the new one. We need to be able to identify what is the current slide. So let's do that. Let's add a state, which we're going to call current slide index. And it's going to be a optional integer, but we're going to default it to 0. And then we're going to, in our scroll view, add a scroll position. And we're going to pass this current slide as an ID. And for this to actually work, we want to have a slide identify itself in this scroll view. So to do that, we're going to very easily pass this modifier where we're going to have the index. And this is the index that we originally were getting from the for each. So with that done, let's verify that this is actually working before I show you the final result. A very easy way to do that is to log the actual slide. So we can do current index slide here, current slide index. And as I'm swiping, you can see that the value is changing. So this means that we're ready to set this up. So very simply, what we're going to be doing is we're going to have a variable inside of the iteration here. We're going to call it isActive. And we're going to say if the current slide index equals this index, right? So we're going to do index here. Let's hide that out. And then we're going to have opacity so that if it's active, we're going to actually show it. Otherwise, hide it. So they're all juxtaposed on top of each other, but you don't see that, you only see the current one. Now this is a little bit boring, obviously, so let's add a little bit of animation. So I'm going to apply a animation modifier where we're gonna do spring just to make it a little bit more smooth. And we're gonna do duration of 0.4. What we want to do is we wanna keep track of a value change. In this case, it's going to be the isActive. So what this means is that we're telling Swift, hey, can we animate this text anytime that the isActive value changes? And because they're all displayed at the same time, this can do it smartly. So if I swipe, you can see that we're already getting like a fade in and fade out effect. But what I also want to do is I want to give it a little bit of offset of X. And we're going to do isActive. When we are on the correct slide, we do 0. But when we are on an off one, we're going to do a -30. So you can see how there's like a little bit of a movement when I'm swiping between these different slides. And for the final component of this slider, we're going to add the indicator. It's going to be a very similar process. We're going to have a H stack in this case, where we're going to be iterating through all of the slides. Now, I don't feel like it's necessary to actually iterate through the slides, so I'm going to do this for each differently. I'm going to do 0. And then we're going to create a range for slides count. And then in this case, the identifier is going to be self, meaning an actual integer. So that way we can just do index in this case. We don't actually need the slide, right? And so for each of these, we're going to have a rounded rectangle. Let's give that a arbitrary large number. Obviously, this is going to occupy all the space. So let's make that a little bit smaller. So we're going to do the width of, in this case, let's just start simple. Let's just do 6, and then height is going to be 6 as well. And let's make it so that when we're on the active slide, this rounded rectangle is actually going to be wider. So very similarly, we can do let is active, current index slide is this index, and then we can do is active. If is active, it's going to be 20, otherwise it's going to be 6. So you can see how it's automatically transitioning. And as I mentioned before, we can drop in an animation modifier here so that if I swipe, it works just fine. Now, this is a little bit of a strong color, I would say, or just like black for a rounded rectangle. What I would recommend is to use a foreground style of tertiary. And tertiary, same as primary and same as secondary, are colors that the system provides. So what this means is you don't actually need to think about the color to use, for example, if you're in dark mode. And you can see how it automatically switches between white when you're in a dark mode with a certain transparency, and then black when you're in light mode. And I would say these are not the same. They're not gonna be literally white and literally black with the same opacity depending on the color scheme. So I definitely recommend to use these standard colors. And this is honestly it. This is more or less the functionality that we want to, but there are a couple things that were specific to my needs that I will highlight that I think you might run into if you want something similar. First is going to be this text. I just gave you the very simple implementation, but if you remember from the final implementation, we're having a large paragraph. In the first part, which is the title, is using regular text color, and then the rest is using like a slightly lighter color. So in order to do that, we first need to combine them. You could do something like this, where you have the title combined literally with the slide description. And this gives you the structure, but what about the color difference, right? The title itself, if I wanted to, I could, for example, make it bold. And by the way, this is a nice trick if you ever want to make your text bold. You can just use markdown syntax and it will automatically apply that bold style. However, this is not what I wanted, right? I wanted to have the second part be a little bit lighter. So in order to do that, I want to introduce you to attributed string. Attributed string is honestly a very powerful aspect of the entire Apple platform that allows you to modify in a very precise way different parts of the text. It can go from colors to different fonts. So for example, you could have the first part of the attributed string could be a title, and then the second part can be a paragraph, and they can be different fonts if you want to, all the way to even embedding images and even interactive content. But obviously we're not gonna get to that in here. And here is gonna be something very simple. We're gonna create a computed property for onboarding slide. We're gonna call that attributed title, or let's actually call it caption. I kind of like that a little bit better. And this is gonna be an attributed string. Now, just to show you that it works straight off the bat, I can just have the attributed string just render the title here. So then I can go back here to my text, and then I can change that to slide caption. The cool thing is that attributed strings you can just pass directly into text. So you don't have to worry about any type of type conversion. So in my case, let's just return this. Let's actually make this a variable. So we're gonna call this the first part. And let's just return the first part just so that this continues to compile. And first I want to have the second part. So that's gonna be second part, and we're gonna do attributed string. This is gonna be description. And then it's very simple. We can have a first part append the second part. And it will more or less work as before, although we do need to add that space at the end of title so that we have that spacing that we had earlier. Other than that, it's basically the same thing. But now that we actually have these different regions of text and coded into an attributed string, that's where the real power comes in. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create what's called an attribute container. So I'm just going to call that a container. It's just going to be an attribute container straight up. And then we're going to say this container is going to have a foreground color of secondary. If you remember what I was saying earlier, secondary is also a standard color of the system. And now the only thing I need to do is have second part, set attributes, and this will take the actual container, right? And with this small change, now you can see how the second part of each of the captions has the right tone, which is a secondary tone. But we're not done yet. We actually need to give a little bit more styling to text, which is not often as intuitive as you would want. So we're first going to change the text a little bit. We're going to make the font be a little bit different. So we're going to use a system font, and we're going to use the style of title 3, I believe is the one that I was playing with. And then we're going to have a design to be serif. I did end up using a different font for my app. It's called Corbin, but just for demonstration purposes, this works just fine. You can see that we have the structure that we wanted, but there are a few things to adjust. For example, I want all of the text to be aligned to the top so that there isn't like a jarring jump between captions that have 2 lines versus 3 lines. So to make this a little bit more standard, let's actually modify our text container to be of frame, max width, infinity. And then we're gonna make the height, let's just give it a nice comfy height of 200. Just like that. Maybe a little bit less, let's do 100 probably. But you can see it's still not aligning correctly, right? So what we actually want to do here is we want to make the alignment itself be top leading. So it's going to make it so that no matter what, no matter how long, the text is always going to be lined up to its own frame, its own container, to the top leading part. And then now we want the Z stack to provide a little bit of padding to all of them, or you can do it at the text level, but I do think it makes more sense to do it at the Z stack level. So the padding is going to be horizontal, and I'm going to make 30, which is the width of the padding on the slider itself as well. And you can see that now we have the correct typesetting for all of these guys. So as a final change, let's add a little bit more spacing between the top and the bottom. I think in this case, maybe the slider itself can have a padding vertical of, maybe we could even make it 30 so it's a little bit consistent across the board, which I actually think might be a little bit too much. So let's go with 20 instead. And I'm gonna remove the default VStack spacing. It normally comes with like 8. So in this case, let's just make it 0 so we can control things a little bit more. And the last thing that I will change is this last slide. You can see that it's actually like, it's actually not aligned with the last slide. It's a little bit of math here, but what I figured out to do here is to add a padding at the end of this slide, but only if it's the last one, which we can do with a padding that is trailing. And in this case, we want to make sure that this index is equals to slides count -1. And if it is, then we're going to add 30, which is the horizontal spacing, plus 12, which is the spacing between each of the slides. Otherwise, we do 0. And just like that, we have it lined up perfectly with our text, and we are done. If you like this video, if you're building anything on SwiftUI or you're building an app, feel free to subscribe. I am Rolando. I'm a software engineer and designer, and I make apps for fun. I document my process and learnings here. I'll catch you guys on the next one.